The Krylorian Syndicate did not value beauty. They valued raw potential and industrial efficiency. When their reclamation fleet first breached the atmosphere of the planet the locals called Solace, their sensors didn't just spike, they malfunctioned. It was officially classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, a biological nightmare where the environment itself was designed to cause maximum trauma. Yet, on the viewscreen of the Syndicate's heavy cruiser, the world looked like a masterpiece of emerald forests and sapphire lakes. Prime Director Voras adjusted his optical sensors, his mandibles clicking with smug satisfaction. Around him, his commanders waited in silence, their various appendages folded in respectful attention. "Look at them," Voras sneered, watching a long-range feed of a human settlement. No orbital defenses, no standing army. They appear to spend their days tending to the vegetation. They are primitives playing with fire and stone, a prey species that happened to inherit a palace. The Syndicate's doctrine was simple. If it doesn't move and looks valuable, secure it. If it moves and isn't us, neutralize it. Down on the surface, Thatcher Vane didn't look like an apex predator. He wore a heavy, stained canvas jacket and boots caked in rich, dark loam. He was currently kneeling in a patch of what looked like simple red lilies, gently trimming a rogue vine. His internal HUD, a relic from his days in the Terran Defense Coalition, was a storm of red warnings. Orbital breach detected, massive energy signatures emerging from the slipstream. Thatcher sighed, a sound of exhausted certainty. He stood up, leaning on a simple wooden staff that was actually a high-density kinetic dampener. He watched as a massive obsidian-black Krylorian drop pod pierced the clouds, trailing a wake of fire. It landed less than 50 meters from his grove, the shockwave flattening the grass and snapping several saplings. The pod hissed open. Prime Director Voras stepped out, flanked by 12 Shadow Guard warriors in bioorganic armor. They looked like gods of death standing in a field of wildflowers. Voras looked at Thatcher, the human appearing small and fragile in his primitive clothing. The Prime Director didn't bother with a translator. He simply signaled for his guards to begin the harvest. One of the soldiers, a brute with a scarred carapace, walked over to a nearby flowering bush, the crown jewel of Thatcher's garden. "Wait," Thatcher said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the aliens' sensory organs tingle with warning instincts they thought they had evolved past. Voras turned, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You speak Galactic Standard, primitive?" "I speak enough to tell you that this grove is sensitive," Thatcher replied, his face an unreadable mask. "If you damage the root system, I can't guarantee the stability of this sector. I'm authorized to offer you one chance, just one, to reconsider." Voras let out a sound like grinding rocks, the Krylorian equivalent of laughter. "You threaten a Prime Director while standing in a dirt field? We are here to reap this world. Every leaf and every drop of water now belongs to the Syndicate." The soldier chuckled and reached out a massive armored claw. He didn't just pluck a flower, he ripped the entire bush out of the ground to show his dominance. The forest went silent. The birds stopped singing. Thatcher Vane didn't move, but he took a slow breath through his nose. He tilted his head slightly and said very quietly, very calmly, "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." Underneath the soil, a low, rhythmic thumping began. It wasn't the sound of machinery. It was the sound of a planet waking up. Prime Director Voras went to speak, but he was interrupted by a scream from the back of his formation. He turned to see one of his shadow guards being pulled, not by a man, but by the grass itself, down into the earth. Thatcher Vane finally looked at the Prime Director, and for just a moment, Voras saw something ancient and predatory flash across the human's face. "You shouldn't have pulled that weed," Thatcher whispered. "That was the only thing keeping the rest of the planet from eating you." The silence that followed Thatcher Vane's statement was heavier than the gravity of a neutron star. Prime Director Voras stood frozen, his multiple eyes twitching, as he watched the spot where his scout had simply vanished into the loam. To the Krylorians, soil was an inert resource, something to be siphoned and sold. They did not understand a world where the ground itself had an appetite. "Rescan the perimeter!" Voras shrieked, his mandibles clacking in a frantic rhythm of distress. "Find the cloaking field. Primitives do not have teleportation tech." "Sir, there is no tech," the tactical officer stammered, his voice climbing into a range reserved for species-wide panic. "The energy signatures are purely biological. The grass is vibrating at a frequency that matches our pulse rates." Thatcher Vane didn't look at the scanners. He didn't have to. He calmly picked up a pair of rusted garden shears from his tool belt. I told you it was a sensitive ecosystem, he said, his voice carrying the exhausted certainty of a man who had seen this tragedy play out a dozen times before. Humans didn't settle Solace because it was pretty. We settled it because we are the only species in the galaxy with the biological imperative to tell this planet no and actually make it stick. Voras leveled his bioorganic rifle at Thatcher's chest. Kill him! Burn the grove! Sterilize everything within a 5-parsec radius. The Shadow Guards opened fire. Plasma bolts, hot enough to vaporize a dreadnought, screamed toward the human gardener. But the bolts never reached him. The red lilies, the ones the soldier had crushed, suddenly swelled, their petals expanding into crystalline shields that absorbed the heat as if it were mere sunlight. That's the Annoyance Protocol in action, Thatcher whispered, his eyes now glowing with the faint, cold blue of a tactical HUD. When you threaten a gardener, you threaten the balance. And when the balance is gone, the planet stops pretending to be a garden and starts being a crucible. Suddenly, the ironwood trees surrounding the clearing didn't just sway. They lunged. Their roots erupted from the earth like coiled snakes, wrapping around the bioorganic armor of the Krylorian warriors. Metal screamed. Chitin cracked. The weeds began to excrete an acid that bypassed the Syndicate's most advanced kinetic shields. Voras watched in horror as his elite unit was dismantled by a landscaping project. "Retreat!" he roared, scrambling back toward the drop pod. "Get us back to the flagship. Launch the planet crackers." "You can't leave, Director," Thatcher said, stepping forward. The lilies at his feet parted like a loyal pack of predators. "You haven't finished your audit. And according to my records, you still owe this planet for every root you just snapped." As the Krylorian drop pod attempted to ignite its thrusters, a massive, bioluminescent tentacle, thick as a battlecruiser, erupted from the sapphire lake nearby. It didn't strike the pod, it simply held it in place, as if reality itself had decided the Syndicate wasn't allowed to go anywhere. Voras looked through the view screen, his 3 eyes widening as he saw the forest canopy peel back to reveal not trees, but thousands of human Defense Force ships that had been cold and silent, masquerading as part of the terrain the entire time. Thatcher Vane leaned on his staff and tapped a command into his earpiece. "Admiral, the Director has completed the field test. He's found our garden unsatisfying. I think it's time we showed him the varsity team." From the sky, a voice boomed. "Calm, professional, and promising future violence. This is the TDC fleet. You have 10 minutes to power down your weapons, or we will stop being the gardeners and start being the exterminators." Voras collapsed into his command chair, his pride crumbling like a sandcastle in a tsunami. He realized too late that the humans hadn't been playing nice. They had been practicing. Inside the trapped drop pod, the air grew thick with the smell of ozone and the frantic, wet clicking of Prime Director Voras's mandibles. On his screens, the emerald beauty of the planet Solace was dissolving into a tactical nightmare. The ironwood roots weren't just crushing his shadow guards, they were bypass shielding into the pod's internal systems, draining power like a biological siphon. "Emergency transmission to the flagship!" Voras shrieked, his feeding tentacles lashing out at his terrified communications officer. "Tell them to glass this sector. If we cannot reap it, we will burn it to the mantle." "Sir, the flagship is not responding," the officer whispered, his skin rippling in a pale white shade of total shock. "The sensors they show 4,000 new contacts appearing from behind the moon and rising from the asteroid belts. They were cold, minimal energy signatures just like the planet. They've been watching us since we entered the system." Outside the pod's reinforced glass, Thatcher Vane stood as unmoved as the mountains behind him. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was simply looking at the uprooted flowering bush, the one the soldier had ripped from the earth. To the Krylorians, it was just biomass. To Thatcher, it was a breach of a billion-year-old contract. "You keep calling us primitives." Thatcher's voice crackled through the pod's external speakers, steady and cold as compressed neutronium. "You looked at our lack of fortifications and assumed we were prey. But in the entire known galaxy, no major civilization remained silent for centuries without a very good reason." Voras lunged at the comms panel. "You are an anomaly. A glitch. We have conquered 17 civilizations with our superior doctrine. Doctrine is for species who have had it easy," Thatcher replied, finally looking Voras in the eye through the glass. "Humans evolved on a planet where every single day was a military training exercise. We invented nuclear weapons before we even mastered basic space travel. We've been practicing violence for far longer than we've been practicing diplomacy. Thatcher gestured to the sky, where the TDC fleet was now visible as bright, burning stars of kinetic energy. We played nice for 73 cycles because we were choosing peace, not because we were incapable of war. We smile because we're happy, Director, not because we don't have teeth. What do you want? Voras demanded, his voice cracking. Gold? Isotopes? We will triple the tithe. We don't want your gold, Thatcher said. And for the first time, a small, predatory smile touched his lips. The kind humans wore right before they started shooting. The Krylorian Syndicate has spent centuries taking what isn't theirs. You've treated the galaxy like a buffet. But humanity is an accountant species at heart. We track every debt, every casualty, every broken route. Thatcher tapped his earpiece. Admiral, initiate Phase 2. The Director has declined the peaceful settlement. It's time to move the Syndicate from the partnership file to the creative disassembly list. On the tactical display, the Krylorian flagship began to unmake. It didn't explode, it simply started to lose power, its reactors going cold as human cyber warfare, perfected during the incident at Proxima, deleted the ship's very ability to exist. Voras fell back into his seat as the pod's internal lights flickered and died. The ironwood roots were now prying open the airlock. The audit has officially begun, Director, Thatcher's voice whispered in the dark. And unfortunately for you, you're the first item on the balance sheet. As the airlock hissed open, Voras saw not a man but the shadow of something much larger rising from the lake. A titan of metal and bone that had been waiting 8,000 years for someone to give it a reason to wake up. The airlock of the drop pod didn't just open. It was peeled back like the skin of a ripened fruit by the ironwood roots. Prime Director Voras was dragged out into the cool mountain air of Solace, his limbs flailing as the bioluminescent vines bound him to a standing stone at the edge of the clearing. He expected to be executed. Instead, he found Thatcher Vane standing over the broken bush, holding a digital tablet that flickered with a list of names and numbers that spanned centuries. What is this? Voras rasped, his eyes darting toward the lake where the massive biomechanical titan continued to rise, its fusion-heated eyes burning like twin suns. This is the cost of acquisition, Thatcher said, his voice flat and clinical. Humans are a species of survivors born from a world that tried to kill us every single day. We learned early on that everything has a price. You didn't just land on a planet. You attempted to liquidate an asset protected by a species that treats war as a training exercise. Thatcher scrolled through the screen. You've spent 300 cycles siphoning the life from 17 smaller civilizations. You thought this was evidence of absence regarding our military, but we weren't missing. We were simply auditing you from the back row of the galaxy. On the tactical display projected into the air, Voras watched his once mighty fleet being dismantled. The human ships weren't even using primary cannons. They were using sympathetic frequency harmonics to safely defuse the Syndicate's weapons before they could even fire. It wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration of tactical prescience, where every Krylorian move had already been countered. We don't want your gold or your territory, Thatcher continued, stepping closer. We want the balance settled. For every human life you threatened, for every prey species you enslaved, and for this sapling you just murdered. He pointed to the uprooted bush. That plant was a 200-year-old experiment in atmospheric restoration. Its value is extensive. The Titan reached the shore, the ground trembling under its 300-meter-tall metallic frame. It looked down at Voras with a calculating intelligence that made the Director's secondary brain stall. We made bargains with things that should not exist so that we could inherit this legacy, Thatcher whispered, leaning in close so only Voras could hear. We became the monsters that other monsters made deals with. And now, you're going to help us update our records. Voras trembled, his arrogance finally stripped away to reveal the terrified being beneath. What are you going to do to me? Thatcher Vane tucked the tablet into his canvas jacket and picked up his rusty garden shears. We're going to go through your memories, Director. We're going to find every individual who authorized your harvests. And then, we're going to send our accountants to visit them. High above, the sky turned a brilliant, blinding white as the human flagship, the final notice, entered low orbit, its shadow eclipsing the entire valley. Wait, Voras shrieked. I can give you the codes. I can give you the locations of our hidden vaults. Thatcher paused, looking up at the massive ship. We already have the codes, Voras. We've had them for 6 weeks. We just needed you to show us exactly how much you were willing to break to get what you wanted. Thatcher turned to the Titan and gave a sharp, two-tone whistle. The massive entity tilted its head and let out a sound that didn't travel through the air but through the ground. A vibration that spoke of ancient, cold fury. Phase 3 is beginning, Thatcher said to his earpiece. Initiate the total restructuring. Suddenly, the Titan's chest cavity began to glow with an intensity that suggested a localized breakdown in physical laws. It wasn't preparing to fire. It was preparing to unmake the reality of the Syndicate's very existence. The light from the Titan's chest was not a beam of plasma, but a wave of shimmering, blue-shifted information that bypassed every firewall the Krylorian Syndicate had ever engineered. On his bound arms, Prime Director Voras's wrist-mounted display began to scroll through data at a blinding speed. He watched in frozen horror as his empire's logos, its bank accounts, and its military codes were overwritten with a simple silver TDC seal. "What are you doing?" Voras screamed, his mandibles clicking in a frantic, wet stutter. "You are erasing us." "We aren't erasing you, Director. We're reformatting you," Thatcher Vane replied, his voice calm as he stepped over the cooling remains of a bioorganic rifle. Humans realized a long time ago that burning a civilization to the ground is wasteful. It leaves too much debris. It's much more efficient to take the existing structure and prune it. Thatcher pointed his tablet toward the sky. Above the clouds, the Syndicate's flagship, the Reaping Hand, was no longer firing. Instead, it was being enveloped by a swarm of small, nimble human restructuring vessels that moved with the same eerie, coordinated grace as the roots in the forest. They weren't using explosives, they were using localized cyber attacks to convince the ship's own AI that it had been resigned from service. "You see, humans are a species of specialists," Thatcher said, kneeling back down to tend to a small patch of grass that had been scorched by a plasma bolt. "We have diplomats, we have warriors, and we have gardeners. But most importantly, we have accountants. And right now, every human serving in your sectors, the janitors you ignored, the haulers you exploited, is finishing their final audit." Voras felt a cold chill settle into his primary heart. "You had people in our sectors?" 3,000 of them, Thatcher confirmed, checking his chronometer. "We've been watching from the back row for cycles, mapping your weaknesses, identifying your targets, and waiting for you to cross the line. You pulling that route wasn't just a mistake. It was the final notice on your account." The Titan let out a low, rhythmic vibration that made the surrounding forest pulse in a synchronized neon blue light. Thatcher's tablet chimed. He looked at the screen and sighed. The same sound of exhausted certainty he'd carried since the first drop pod landed. "Your homeworld, Kryler Prime, has just accepted our terms," Thatcher said, looking up at the Director. "They surrendered without a single shot being fired. It turns out when you show a civilization exactly how much their leadership has been stealing from the garden, they tend to be very cooperative with the new management." Voras slumped against the standing stone, his feeding tentacles limp. He realized now that the humans didn't conquer with strength. They conquered with context. They had turned his own people against him with nothing more than a spreadsheet of his sins. "So what now?" Voras rasped. "Am I to be fertilizer?" Thatcher Vane stood up, dusting the rich Solace soil from his apron. "No, Director. You're going to stay here and help me replant this grove. You're going to learn exactly how much work it takes to keep a Deathworld from eating everything in its path." But as Thatcher spoke, a new alarm blared from his earpiece. His predatory HUD flickered back to life, and he looked toward the horizon with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Sir," a voice crackled over Thatcher's comms. "The Krylorian Syndicate wasn't acting alone. We just detected a second fleet. Different signatures. They aren't siphoning, they're burning." Thatcher Vane's face went hard, his jaw tightening. He looked at the shears in his hand and then back at the sky. "The Hegemony of Valesk," he whispered. "They didn't pay attention to the audit. They think they can catch the gardener while he's busy." From the dark clouds above, a massive, jagged ship made of scorched bone and black metal descended, its weapons already glowing with the fire of planetary sterilization. The sky over Solace didn't just darken, it bruised. The Hegemony of Valesk were not merchants like the Syndicate. They were religious fundamentalists of the pure void. To them, a Class 12 Deathworld was a biological heresy that needed to be cauterized. Their flagship, the Ashmaker, a jagged cathedral of obsidian and bone, hung in the upper atmosphere like a guillotine. High Inquisitor Kalen stared at the holographic display of the planet's surface. Unlike the Krylorians, he didn't care about the ironwood or the sentient lilies. He saw only a mess that needed cleaning. The Syndicate has failed because they tried to touch the garden. Kalen's voice rasped through his breathing mask, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. We will not touch it. We will simply remove the oxygen, prime the thermal lance, target the human settlement and the Titan signature. Down in the clearing, Thatcher Vane stood perfectly still. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of high-altitude radiation. Beside him, the captured Prime Director Voras was shaking so violently his chitinous plates rattled. You don't understand, Voras whimpered, looking up at the black spear in the sky. The Valesk don't negotiate. They don't audit. They just burn. They'll kill us both. Thatcher didn't look at him. He was watching his tablet, his fingers moving with a surgical precision that betrayed no fear. The Valesk are a predictable variable, Voras. They think fire is the ultimate solution. They haven't realized that on a planet like Solace, fire is just a form of fertilizer. Thatcher tapped a final command and looked at the horizon. Admiral, the Valesk have skipped the notice phase and gone straight to eviction. Activate the Aegis-Bloom. From the bridge of the human flagship, the final notice, Admiral Sarah Vance gave the order. She didn't launch missiles. She didn't fire lasers. Instead, a series of small green canisters were launched from the human ships, scattered like seeds across the atmosphere of the entire continent. On the Ashmaker, the tactical sensors screamed. Inquisitor! The humans are seeding the clouds with biological spores. They are accelerating the growth of the atmosphere. Irrelevant, Kalen hissed. Fire the lance. A beam of pure, white-hot thermal energy erupted from the Valesk ship, a pillar of fire aimed directly at Thatcher's Grove. It should have vaporized everything within 10 miles. It should have turned the mountain to glass. But as the beam hit the upper atmosphere, the spores reacted. The sky didn't burn. It bloomed. A massive, translucent canopy of hyper-oxygenated fungal matter expanded in a microsecond, forming a biological shield that didn't just block the heat, it absorbed it. The thermal energy was converted into raw kinetic growth. The Aegis-Bloom glowed a brilliant, angry violet as it fed on the Valesk's own weapon. Thatcher Vane looked up, the purple light reflecting in his cold blue eyes. You see, Director? In a garden, nothing is wasted. Not even the fire of your enemies. The Valesk beam flickered and died, its energy entirely drained by the ravenous plants in the sky. In its place, the violet canopy began to drop heavy fruit, pod-shaped organic masses that fell toward the Valesk fleet like biological meteors. They are boarding us, the Valesk officer cried. The plants! They are prying open the hull. Thatcher Vane picked up his garden shears and turned toward the Valesk ship, which was now struggling to stay in orbit as vines thick as skyscrapers began to reach up from the forest floor, tethered to the heavy fruit pods. The Valesk came to burn the garden, Thatcher said, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of pure, predatory intent. But they forgot that the most dangerous part of a garden isn't the flowers. It's the pest control. Suddenly, the Ashmaker's internal communications were hijacked. A single image appeared on every screen in the Valesk fleet. A human skull wrapped in a crown of thorns. This is Thatcher Vane. The voice echoed through the halls of the Valesk ship. You've disturbed the peace of a protected sector. I'm coming up there now to collect the cleaning fee. The heavy fruit pods on the Valesk hull didn't explode. They opened. And out stepped the Gardeners, human special forces in power armor that looked more like insectoid carapaces than metal. Inside the obsidian corridors of the Ashmaker, the air didn't smell like incense and ancient prayers anymore. It smelled like wet earth and ozone. The heavy fruit pods hadn't just smashed through the hull, they had integrated with it. Biomechanical vines pulsed with a neon blue light, weaving through the Valesk ship's wiring, turning its own security systems into blind, useless appendages. High Inquisitor Kalen gripped his ceremonial staff, his four eyes wide as he watched his elite purifiers being systematically dismantled. On the security feed, the human Gardeners didn't move like soldiers. They moved like shadows across a forest floor, silent, fluid, and terrifyingly efficient. They wore Viridian pattern power armor that shifted colors to match the ship's dark interior, making them nearly invisible until they were already swinging their high-frequency pruning blades. They are not using firearms, a Valesk bridge officer shrieked. They are dismantling our armor with surgical precision. They are taking our soldiers alive. They aren't taking them alive, Kalen whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in 3 centuries. They are weeding them. Down on the surface, Thatcher Vane stood in the center of the clearing, his tablet glowing with the ship's internal schematics. He was no longer leaning on his staff. He held it like a conductor's baton. Beside him, Prime Director Voras watched the holographic playback of the massacre above. He saw a Valesk squad attempt to fire a heavy fusion cannon. Before the trigger could be pulled, a human gardener dropped from the ceiling, touched the barrel with a glowing glove, and the entire weapon simply wilted. The metal lost its structural integrity and slumped to the floor like rotted wood. Molecular destabilization? Voras gasped. You've weaponized the very nature of decay? We call it the compost protocol, Thatcher said, his eyes fixed on the bridge of the Ashmaker. The Valesk believe that fire is the only way to cleanse. We believe that everything, even a starship, is eventually destined to return to the soil. We're just accelerating the timeline. Through the comms, Admiral Sarah Vance's voice broke the tension. Thatcher, we've secured the engine room. But we've found something in the Valesk data vault. They weren't here to burn the planet because of religious dogma. They were here because their sensors picked up a signal from the core. A signal that predates the hegemony by 1 billion years. Thatcher's jaw tightened. He looked down at the uprooted bush, the one that had started this entire conflict. The seed cipher, he muttered. They didn't want to burn the garden. They wanted to wake up the gardener. Voras looked between Thatcher and the massive titan standing at the lake's edge. What gardener? Thatcher, what is this planet? Solace isn't a planet, Voras, Thatcher said, his voice dropping to a haunting whisper. It's an incubator. And humanity isn't its owner. We're the gatekeepers. We were put here to make sure that whatever is sleeping in that core never hears a reason to wake up. Suddenly the ground beneath them didn't just shake, it groaned. A sound so deep and resonant it bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in their marrow. The titan at the lake's edge lowered its head, its fusion eyes turning from bright white to a deep, warning violet. On the Ashmaker, High Inquisitor Kalen saw the same reading. A smile, jagged and insane, spread across his face. You were too late, Gardener, he roared into the comms, his voice echoing in Thatcher's earpiece. Our thermal lance didn't just hit your shield. We reflected the resonance into the mantle. The original heir has heard the call. Thatcher Vane didn't panic. He looked at his garden shears, then at the sky where the Valesk ship was beginning to lose altitude, dragged down by the massive vines reaching from the earth. Admiral, Thatcher said, his voice deathly quiet. Initiate the winter solstice protocol. We have to put the planet back to sleep. And we have to do it before the Valesk realize what they've actually invited to dinner. From the forest floor, a massive crack opened. Not of rock, but of glowing, white-hot energy. Something was rising from the depths of Solace, and it wasn't human. The groan that vibrated through the crust of Solace wasn't the sound of tectonic plates shifting. It was the sound of a billion-year-old consciousness clearing its throat. In the clearing, the glowing white fissure continued to widen, venting a mist that smelled like ancient rain and ozone. Thatcher Vane stood at the edge of the chasm, his canvas jacket fluttering in the sudden, violent updraft. The Valesk didn't just hit a shield, Thatcher said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the awakening world. They hit the alarm clock. This planet isn't a Class 12 Deathworld because of the plants, Voras. It's a Deathworld because it's the cradle of the precursor terraforming engine. And it does not like being woken up by fire. High above the Ashmaker was no longer a ship. It was a trellis. The massive vines reaching from the forest had woven themselves through the Valesk flagship's engines, dragging it down toward the hungry canopy. On the bridge, High Inquisitor Kalen watched his screens go black as the biological spores from the Aegis-Bloom began to consume his ship's very oxygen supply. If we die in the light of the purge, Kalen screamed, reaching for the manual override of the ship's primary reactor. If the original heir wakes, it will cleanse this sector of your human filth. Admiral Vance! Thatcher barked into his comms, ignoring the Inquisitor's fanatical raving. Status on the winter solstice dampeners? In position, Thatcher, the Admiral's voice replied, tight with tension. But we have a problem. The Valesk reactor is slave to the planet's core resonance now. If that ship hits the surface while the reactor is critical, it won't just wake the Gardener, it'll drive it into a hyper-defense state. It'll terraform the entire Sol system into a jungle in under an hour. Earth won't survive the transition. Thatcher Vane looked at the massive titan by the lake. The entity was no longer standing still. Its metallic skin was rippling, shifting from defensive plating into a series of intake vents. It was preparing to receive the data stream from the core. Voras? Thatcher turned to the trembling Krylorian director. You wanted to know why humans are the gatekeepers? Because we're the only ones crazy enough to put our hands in the gears of a god. Thatcher didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the wooden staff, the one he'd used as a walking stick. He slammed it into the soft earth at the edge of the white-hot fissure. The iron wood didn't break. It hummed. The staff was a neural bypass key, carved from the heart of the original seed tree. Winter is coming early, Thatcher whispered. He twisted the staff, and a pulse of deep, sub-zero energy rippled out from the clearing. The Winter Solstice Protocol wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a cryogenetic reset. In an instant, the sweltering heat of the awakening core was met by an artificial frost. The glowing white light of the fissure turned a brittle, crystalline blue. The ironwood trees didn't just stop moving. They petrified, their sap freezing into a high-density diamond glass. The massive vines tethered to the ashmaker didn't snap. They contracted, pulling the Valesk ship into a fixed, frozen orbit, trapping it in a web of unbreakable ice. The groan from the planet's core shifted into a low, mournful hum. The awakening was being forced back into a slumber. But the cost was immediate. Thatcher Vane fell to his knees, his hands frosting over as the staff drained his own thermal energy to power the bypass. The garden was a closed loop, and the gardener was the only available battery. Thatcher! Admiral Vance's voice screamed over the comms. Your vitals are dropping. Break the connection. Not yet, Thatcher gasped, his breath blooming in the frozen air. The Valesk. The Inquisitor is still inside the loop. He's trying to override the dampener from the Ashmaker's bridge. He's going to force the core to bypass the freeze. On the holographic display, a red line began to crawl back up the blue, dampening field. Kalen was sacrificing his own crew, venting their life force into the ship's reactors to create enough heat to break Thatcher's frost. He's going to wake it, Voras whispered, watching the ice on the Ashmaker begin to crack. He's going to kill us all just to see the world burn. Thatcher Vane looked at the rusty garden shears on his belt, then at the frozen staff. He reached out with a trembling, frost-covered hand and tapped a final, hidden sequence on his tablet. Admiral, Thatcher said, his voice a ghost of a whisper, initiate the final audit. If we can't freeze the ship, we have to unmake the captain. Suddenly, the Ashmaker's internal gravity didn't just fail, it reversed. The human gardeners inside the ship didn't retreat. They converged on the bridge, their armor glowing with a terrifying, white-hot intensity. They weren't there to fight the Valesk. They were there to be the conduits. The Titan by the lake suddenly turned its head toward the sky. Its violet eyes flared. What are they doing? Voras asked, shielding his eyes from the glare. They're giving the planet a target, Thatcher said, falling onto his side as the cold finally claimed his consciousness. The gardener doesn't like being woken up, but it hates pests even more. The Ashmaker didn't explode. It was simply erased. A beam of pure biological light erupted from the Titan's chest, striking the Valesk ship and turning its obsidian hull into a cloud of drifting, harmless pollen in a single microsecond. The threat was gone. The silence returned. But Thatcher Vane lay still on the frozen ground, his staff still glowing with a dying blue light. Voras crawled toward the human, his mandibles clicking in a sound of genuine concern. Thatcher? Gardener? Wake up! The audit isn't finished. From the edge of the clearing, a new shadow appeared. It wasn't an alien. It was a woman in a high-ranking TDC uniform, stepping off a silent shuttle. She looked at the frozen grove, then at the fallen man. The audit is never finished, Director, Admiral Sarah Vance said, her eyes hard as flint. But the billing cycle has just changed. She looked at her tablet where a new signal was blinking. A signal from the deep space array. We have a problem, she whispered. The Valesk weren't the ones who sent the Ashmaker. They were just the distraction. Thatcher Vane didn't wake up in a hospital. He woke up in a sensory deprivation tank aboard the Final Notice. His skin was no longer pale from the frost. It was humming with a faint, bioluminescent gold, the mark of the seed cipher's feedback. As the medical gel drained, he saw Admiral Sarah Vance standing behind the reinforced glass, her face a map of exhaustion and grim calculation. You've been under for 6 hours, Thatcher, Sarah said, her voice filtered through the tank's comms. The Titan put the core back to sleep, but the energy spike was seen across the quadrant. The Valesk were just the scavengers. The Oros Collective has arrived. Thatcher stepped out of the tank, his movements fluid and unnervingly fast. The Oros don't scavenge, he whispered, grabbing a fresh set of canvas fatigues. They consume. They don't want the soil or the minerals. They want the Genesis key inside the planet's core to reformat the galaxy. To them, we are just the weeds in their way. They brought a World Eater-class station, Sarah said, flicking a holographic display into the center of the room. A jagged, moon-sized structure was visible at the edge of the Sol system, surrounded by a swarm of ships that looked like shards of broken glass. They aren't even bothering with a landing party. They're preparing a gravity well to rip Solace apart from the inside out. Beside the display stood Prime Director Voras. The Krylorian looked different. His chitinous plates were dull, and he was staring at Thatcher with a mixture of terror and awe. "I told them," Voras rasped. "I told them what you did to the Ashmaker. They didn't care. They said the human anomaly is a temporary infection." Thatcher Vane ignored the alien. He walked to the bridge window looking down at the planet Solace. The blue ice from his winter solstice protocol was still visible on the mountains, but the forests were pulsing with an angry red light. The planet knew its predators were close. "Admiral," Thatcher said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm tone that signaled the end of diplomacy. "We've spent 8,000 years pretending to be the gatekeepers, so the galaxy wouldn't realize we were actually the bait. We've been keeping this planet quiet not to protect it, but to protect the rest of them from what happens when the gardener stops caring about the garden." Sarah Vance narrowed her eyes. "Thatcher, the Edict of Sol is clear. We do not activate the final bloom unless the species end event is confirmed." "Look at the scanners, Sarah," Thatcher replied, pointing to the Oros moon station. "They just fired a gravity anchor at Earth. They aren't just targeting the garden, they're targeting the farmer." The ship suddenly shuddered as a massive gravitational wave hit the final notice. Alarm screamed. On the tactical HUD, the moon-sized station began to glow with a sickly violet energy. They weren't waiting, they were starting the harvest. Thatcher Vane turned to the command console and pressed his thumb against a hidden sensor. The screen didn't ask for a password, it asked for a pulse match. "The audit is over," Thatcher said, his eyes turning entirely gold as the seed cipher inside him fully synchronized with the planet below. "Initiate the total harvest. If the Oros want to see what a precursor engine can do, we're going to give them a front row seat." Down on the surface of Solace, the mountains didn't just shake, they opened. The Titan at the lake's edge was joined by 12 others, rising from the crust like ancient metallic gods. But they didn't look toward the Oros fleet. They turned their massive, burning eyes toward the sun. "What are they doing?" Voras screamed, clutching the railing. "They're not defenders, Voras," Thatcher said as the final notice began to accelerate toward the Oros station. "They're fuel injectors. We're about to turn the entire Sol system into a controlled explosion." In the distance, the sun began to change color, shifting from yellow to a violent, screaming white. The sun didn't go supernova. It didn't explode. It focused. Under the command of the 12 Titans on Solace, the gravity of the star was harnessed and shaped into a singular, coherent beam of solar-resonant energy. On the bridge of the final notice, Thatcher Vane stood with his hands gripped onto the console, his golden eyes reflecting the impossible light of a star being used as a magnifying glass. "The Oros Collective thinks in terms of consumption." Thatcher's voice was a dual-tone echo, layered with the ancient resonance of the planet itself. "They see a system as a pantry. They don't understand that a garden is a living, breathing entity that knows how to defend its own roots." Admiral Sarah Vance watched the tactical overlay. The Oros World Eater Station, a structure that had survived 10,000 years of galactic warfare, wasn't just melting, it was being unwritten. The solar beam, tuned to the exact frequency of the seed cipher, was stripping the Oros technology of its molecular cohesion. The station was turning into a cloud of glowing, golden dust that drifted away on the solar wind. "They're gone," Sarah whispered. "The entire fleet, it's just biomass now." "Not just biomass, Admiral," Thatcher said, his golden eyes slowly fading back to their natural blue. "It's fertilizer. The Oros wanted to harvest this system. Instead, they've just provided the nutrients for the next 10,000 years of Solace's growth." As the solar beam dissipated and the sun returned to its natural yellow hue, the Titans on the surface began to sink back into the crust. The white-hot fissures closed and the ironwood trees returned to their silent, petrified state. The winter solstice protocol was finally complete. The planet was falling back into its long, protective sleep. Thatcher Vane collapsed into a chair, the immense strain of the synchronization finally taking its toll. Prime Director Voras crawled out from behind the command station, his mandibles trembling. He looked at Thatcher, then at the empty space where a moon-sized threat had existed only minutes before. You used your own star as a weapon, Voras stammered. The entire galaxy. They'll be terrified. They'll call you monsters. Let them, Thatcher replied, wiping a streak of silver-colored blood from his nose. Fear is a very effective fence. It keeps the pests away without us having to pick up the shears. 6 months later, the galaxy had changed. The Krylorian Syndicate and the Hegemony of Valesk were no longer empires. They were subsectors under restoration. Human accountants moved through their systems, not with guns, but with data slates, restructuring their economies to be sustainable, peaceful, and, most importantly, indebted to the Terran coalition. Thatcher Vane was back in his valley on Solace. The frost had melted, and the blue lilies were blooming again. He was kneeling in the dirt, carefully replanting the bush that the Krylorian soldier had uprooted at the very beginning. A shadow fell over him. He didn't look up to know it was Admiral Vance. "The Galactic Council just passed the new accords, Thatcher," she said, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Humanity has been given the permanent back row seat. We officially oversee all biological and environmental stability for the quadrant." Nobody argued, not even the Valdrins. "Good," Thatcher said, patting the soil around the new roots. "Maybe now I can finally finish my pruning. The galaxy is calling us the Predator Gardeners, Thatcher. They're afraid of us." Thatcher finally stood up, leaning on his wooden staff. He looked out over the lush green horizon of the Class 12 Deathworld, a planet that could kill an unprepared army in an hour, yet looked like a paradise under his care. "They should be afraid, Sarah," Thatcher said with a small, tired smile, "because we've finished the audit. We've balanced the books, and the galaxy finally understands the most important rule of the garden." He looked at the camera, at the viewer, with eyes that still held a faint, lingering spark of gold. "The gardener only smiles as long as the weeds stay in their place.